SEGA Bits presents SEGA Talk, a podcast talking all things SEGA! With your hosts, George and Barry.
Look, it's a giant talking egg. I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to the master here. So what?
Hello and welcome to SEGA Talk, episode number 35. This podcast is basically the podcast where we pick one piece of Sega software or hardware and we dedicate a whole episode talking about it. In this episode, we're talking about the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive cult classic Gunstar Heroes, which came out in September 1993. And so every single time we open this up, we always talk about our history with the game. So Barry, let me ask you, what do you think and how did you feel when you first played Gunstar Heroes, and when did you first hear about it? And obviously, I don't think it was day one, right?
No, absolutely not. Hello and welcome to SEGA Talk. I'm Barry. I think whenever we cover games from the Genesis Mega Drive, I always preface it with saying, like, I started on the Genesis, like, playing very minimal Sega games, like Sonic. I would rent some of the Sega titles, but honestly, like, I didn't know what was what. However, you know, like, I would recognize stuff like Konami. And then, of course, there's the Treasure logo. So I'm trying to think back. I cannot remember playing this on release. But I feel like Dynamite Heady, I did rent. It seems a little, you know, like I feel like I remember that. But honestly, like, I think the first time I played this was when they started sticking it in compilations. So that would probably be the maybe late 90s or early 2000s. But this is like a favorite of compilations. Like, if they were ever going to do re-releases for Genesis or Mega Drive, you will always see this game. Always.
Oh, yeah. Always.
Yeah. So I don't have a long history with it, but as soon as I played this, I like completely understood why people love Treasure so much. And I went out and tried out all their other games and I love them all. So I'm looking forward to talking about this. I'm no expert, but that's why we have show notes. So I'm looking forward to this.
My first time playing the game, it was one of those games where, like, I didn't really know about it. Like, growing up, when I was, like, in elementary school, it was, like, in a very small town. Nobody played video games, really, in that town. So when I went to, like, middle school, I started, like, actually seeing people that, like, liked different games, just expanding. And one of the games that I was lent was Gunstar Heroes. I've never heard of it before that. And it was already old. Like, we were already in the closing up the PlayStation 1 and Saturn era. So it was weird that I never heard of it. I mean, it just seems so up my alley, you know, anime. It has that anime look, crazy levels. I used to love Contra growing up. It had, I don't know, it's just insane. Like, the bosses were so different. They put so much thought and effort into, like, just the design of the levels. Like, you could tell nothing was intentional. And sometimes obviously no games are intentional, but in this era, you would always play those games where they would repeat things. You could tell where they're like, all right, we need to add more hours into this game. And I really appreciated that they didn't even care. Like, they just went like, this is the game. You pick your levels. I also love that about the game, that you could pick what stage you wanted to play. Kind of reminded me of Mega Man in the beginning. It also,
for sure.
The hand-to-hand combat, all the little things like that, that blew my mind. And another game that I discovered from the same guy, he would just lend me them because he liked me giving him feedback about them, was Chrono Trigger was another game. It was like super rare. I never played it. And he lent me that one. So that's another game that I heard about because of this. So yes, a lot of good games came out of this. But talking about Gunstar Hero, you can't really talk about it without talking about the creation of Treasure, because it was literally, I guess, the game that created the team. It was the debut game. So Gunstar Heroes meant a lot to Treasure because the idea of the game was something that developers had in mind since 1991. Keep in mind, the company was founded in 1993, 2 years before the idea of Gunstar Heroes. At the time, Treasure leader Masato Magawa was working at Konami with developers who would become Treasure. According to September 1993 interview with Game Fan magazine, the company officially started in June 19th, 1992. Okay, so sorry, not 93, it was 92. Which started because Treasure president Masato Magawa always wanted his own company. The company started with only 18 employees, with almost everyone being a programmer. The youngest member of the team was 19, the oldest was 37, but the average age for an employee was 27. When they asked him why they left Konami, he said, basically, Konami is a huge company. They cannot create games. We cannot create games freely. Konami's big titles are TMNT, Castlevania, etc. I just couldn't stand making more sequels, but in order to drive sales, sequels must always be made. When I presented my idea for Gunstar Heroes, they said, no, it will not sell. You see, they only want the sure thing because they are such a high profile company. But are you surprised? Okay, so from what I can gather, a lot of the talent Sega acquired for the Sega Genesis tended to be on the younger side, especially in-house. But are you surprised the average age of a person that left Konami to join a smaller company was 27 years old? I don't know. Like, to me, it feels like something that like a 19-year-old would do, you know, like, oh, it's an exciting project. I don't have a family right now. But in Japan, 27 is pretty mature, right? Like, they're already settled down.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah,
like if you have a family, right? You're married, you have a house, you have a mortgage, you have all this thing. Would you leave Konami to join a brand new company from a guy that you used to work with in the team?
I mean, I have to imagine that they were getting tired of working on not I don't want to say unoriginal games, but like you look at what he was mentioning, like those are great titles to have under your belt, but after a certain amount of time, you want to break out. And I'm honestly getting vibes of the Platinum Games story, really.
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, like they were like, we're getting sick of making Devil May Cry again and again. The company we work for is getting, you know, like it's not terrible, but it's just kind of like it's creatively stifling. And so they went off and they did their own thing. And I feel like you look at the library of games that Treasure did, and you look at the library of games that Platinum Games have done, and I see a lot of similarities there.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they're games that people point to now and are like saying they're some of the greatest games they've ever played. Like I could easily say that Gunstar Heroes is up there with like Bayonetta in terms of like its greatness at the time. You know what I mean?
Yes,
like,
yes.
And so, you know, I see that as a very good reason. I mean, it's a risk, but I have to imagine that you trust the person you're working with, and I think their trust was put in the right place at that time, for sure.
And it's kind of insane. Well, yeah, but like, yeah, right now, actually, though, I think like it's funny that we're talking about Konami in in their height. Now that they don't even make any arcade games, like back then they were like a big cheese. Because I remember like being a little kid and going to like the roller like little, you know, where you skate. And I remember they used to have arcades, like literally 75% where everybody was playing either Street Fighter 2 or TMNT or like those licensed games. The Simpsons was also really popular. So it's interesting that they would leave that. Like, I'm pretty sure working at Konami is cushy. Is everything all right?
Yeah, I dropped my phone rumbled down on the floor.
But
keep going.
No, yeah, okay. I was just saying that, like, I don't know if I would be able to leave a company like Konami because I would see it differently. I understand that people are kind of mad, like, they don't have creative freedoms. But to me, I think people playing what you create also means a lot.
Yeah,
I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, when I saw all those games there, like, I don't know. It maybe just meant to me a lot seeing really good licensed games that they took good care of the IP. It's not something you saw a lot back then, especially with TMNT. There was a lot of bad TMNT games, a lot of bad Simpsons games. So to me, maybe I just appreciate the work they did into them, and maybe they just didn't like doing it, but I appreciate the work they did. So
my phone's fine, by the way.
Oh, I do care.
I will say this episode's brought to you by Otterbacks. They do a fantastic job, and Baby Yoda. So, yeah, no, go on.
Treasure founder and president, and yes, he is still the president of Treasure till this day. Masato Magawa was always a fan of the video game industry and he always wanted to work. Started learning programming in junior high school, studied it in college, and was hired right after graduating by Konami. Magawa himself was only worked at Konami for a few short years, but let me mention some of these arcade / Super Nintendo titles they worked on. The Simpsons Arcade from 1991, Bucky O'Hare 1992, Super Castlevania 4 1991, Contra 3 The Alien Wars 92, and Axelai. I don't know, is that how you say that name? I've never
Axelay? I've never heard of that game.
Neither have I. 1992. The team at Konami had disagreements with how Konami wanted to continue making popular sequels. Obviously, we said that. And they thought more people would want to play original games like Gunstar Heroes. Obviously, Konami disagreed. Growing up in the 90s and seeing arcade games, do you think Konami or Treasure were wrong in this instance? Obviously, I don't know. I feel like you have to have for me, you have to have like a balance, right? Like you can't just be all one in as a company. Right. You can't be all in on original IPs because that's hurt Sega over the time, like not making sequels to Streets of Rage or Jet Set Radio, in my opinion. But at the same time, I guess it depends on where you're standing, right? Making money or making games.
Yeah, it's tricky because looking at Konami's catalog, they have a lot of great games, but it's true they really like to do their licensed titles, and they really like to do their franchises. Looking at this list, it's 2 licensed titles, 2 franchises, and then Axelay, which I've never heard of. I don't know if that counts as them actually doing something that isn't a franchise. I'm looking. It's just a shmup. That's all it is. It's
not creative.
In the same vein as Life Force and Gradius. So, yeah, looking at it, I don't know, nothing too exciting here. But you look at the opposite side, you look at Treasure. They never really did franchises. They never did any licensed titles, to my memory. And so, I think to be successful, you need a mix. Honestly, we're Sega fans. You look at Sega's back catalog, they kind of have a mix. They have licensed games, they have franchises, they have one-offs, and that's why I love the company. I think Konami could have tried to do a few more, I don't want to say one-offs, but games that they're not afraid to have it be a one and done. It's okay that it's not a franchise. And I think nowadays, even with movies, people are afraid to make movies that are one and done. They always have to set it up to be a franchise, which actually hurts it, if anything, because they're putting less focus on what they're working on, and instead are oh, what's the post-credits scene going to be? What's this or that? And I think with video games, they fall into that trap too, because they're either let's not put our all into this. Let's, hold off until a sequel to introduce this or that. Or in the case of Shenmue, they won't finish the game. They'll be oh, we're going to make 15 of them.
Yeah.
And so it's
and when you said there wasn't franchises, Gunstar Heroes, and we talked about Guardian Heroes not that long ago. Those are technically got sequels, but you said, they didn't strike when the iron was hot. They waited, and then it's a decade later. It's a little hard to get those old fans excited.
Right.
So to me, it's you have to strike with the iron's hot and not be afraid to try new ideas. I think sometimes it works for some franchises, sometimes it doesn't. But even though they wanted to make original titles, Sega did not agree with them, apparently. While the company pitched Sega Gunstar Heroes, Sega wasn't so keen on funding it and instead asked the studio to work on McDonald's Treasure Land Adventure, a licensed game that Sega wanted to put out in the market. After months of working on the licensed game, Sega had a change of heart and approved their action game project. While Treasure finished development on McDonald's Treasure Land Adventure first, they wanted to launch Gunstar Heroes first, as it was an original title for the company and it wanted an original title to be their debut game. Did you ever play McDonald's Treasure Land Adventure? And did you know this was developed by the super hardcore gamer company known as Treasure?
Obviously not, because as I just said, I wasn't aware of them doing any licensed titles, and here I am eating my own words like a fool.
Right. I think it's kind of more underground, but I didn't know about it, but go on.
I was aware though that it was made by someone notable. I think I had forgotten it was a Treasure title. But you'd see this a lot back then. Like there would be these games that just look disposable. Like you're like, oh, the NES Ghostbusters sucked. Why would I play the Genesis one? And I'm like, you do know Compile worked on it, and it's like a really good platformer, but people wouldn't know. So, yeah, I mean, Cool Spot is one of my favorite games, and that's a license. It's a soda pop, soda pop.
This was actually super popular idea back in the day, and I'm pretty sure. I mean, I'm not sure how it was going, but I do know Sega of America had a lot of McDonald's tie-ins, so I'm not surprised that there was some sort of arrangement for this game. But the only reason I remember this game, and it's kind of crazy though, because when I was a kid, I remember I used to be taken care of in one of my with my cousins. When we rented games. I was all addicted to the idea of renting like platformers and stuff at the time. Pretty obsessed with like Adventure Island. Mm-hmm. But my cousin had a Genesis at the time, and he rented this game and a few others. I didn't even want to play it because I was like, McDonald's? What the like? Come on, dude. Seriously? Like, this isn't even an original game. Like, when I was a kid, I just did not like the idea of licensed games, especially like fast food licensing games. Mm-hmm. It just seems so cheap. And then when you see that cover, it's too kiddie-ish. The whole game is super kiddie-ish, right? So even though I was a kid, I mean, I thought, come on, everybody.
Well, I will admit,
I didn't really play it, by the way. So I don't really know.
Wish the Taco Bell dog had his own game. I don't think he ever did.
The only person that deserves deserves a game is a Taco Bell Chihuahua dog. That's true.
Exactly.
So one of the biggest draws for Treasure to work with Sega was that they were a big fan of the Sega Genesis / Mega Drive's Motorola 68,000 microprocessor. The team felt that it was more powerful than Super Nintendo and easier to program for. And for some reason, never mind. Here's the interview. In the same 1993 interview with Treasure, they got more. They talked about basically. So the question they asked him was, Konami is a big third party for Nintendo, so why are you now making games for Sega? Mm-hmm. And according to Treasure, I've always been fascinated with hardware. People are constantly comparing Mega Drive to Super Nintendo, saying that the Super Nintendo has more colors, etc. But the Mega Drive has a 68,000 processor, which is very easy to program for and to work with. I was a programmer for years making games for Super Nintendo, and I can tell you the hardware is a pain in the butt. If consumers look at a steel shot, they think the Super Nintendo is better, but actually, if you try to put Gunstar Heroes onto the Super Nintendo, there would be no way. See those bosses? On the Super Nintendo, they would slow down. The movement requires so much computation, it would only be done on Sega hardware. And then the question was, how many colors do you have on screen with Gunstar? Actually, there are only 64, but we can make it look much more by adding shadows and lighting effects, etc. When you look at Sonic or Gunstar, you would think that they display more than 64 colors, but they don't. We just make it look more. In my opinion, the color looks as good as the Super Nintendo. We can also make it appear that 3 to 4 screens are present, although you can supposedly only display 2. They're talking about the panning in the background when you walk, the layers in the background.
Right.
At once. As I said, the hardware is very easy to work with. All things considered, the 68K is very good CPU, allowing room for experimentation, while the Super Nintendo hardware limits you in their design choices. Scaling and rotation can be implemented in Sega software. Forget the Super Nintendo. Forget it. What?
Wow.
Super what? I've never heard of the Super Nintendo. Have you ever heard of Super Nintendo?
Super what? I don't know.
Super what?
Not super to me.
Not very super. What do you think of this ammo for the good old Sega Genesis versus Super Nintendo console wars? Keep in mind that at this point, Treasure's Future were tied with Sega, and they needed the Genesis to succeed. Not really. I mean, it was 93 at this point. I mean, it was already
right.
It's already a success. But what do you think you think they make things up like this?
I mean, it's hard to say. These guys are developers. They have a different way of looking at these things, these consoles. I don't think he's coming from a fanboy perspective, because he did cite working on the SNES. And I know when a developer likes a piece of hardware, they're not going to BS. They'll be like, look, SNES was a dream to work for. It was really easy to work on. The Genesis is just as easy, and it's more powerful. Like, he would have said something like that, I think. I don't think he would lie, and I don't think he'd be throwing SNES under the bus if it was actually true, at least in his opinion, because you have to remember, he's making a certain type of game that he felt was just impossible on the SNES. So, sorry, guys.
I mean, what do you think about the 64? I mean, this is something that we even talked with the Sega Genesis, Al Nielsen, the marketing. And his thing was very proudly displaying Sonic the Hedgehog to people and telling them, like, this one has X amount of colors, the Super Nintendo, and Sonic has X. Do you see the difference in the color? And everybody would always come out saying they'd rather play Sonic. And this is kind of like a big marketing ploy. I'm not saying there's anything bad about Mario, but like one of the big marketing pushes against with the Super Nintendo was that it had more color. And I feel like I agree with them in that aspect, because one of the first things I remember when I played Gunstar Heroes was how bright it was, how much color it looked like it had. It just felt like there was the diversity in stages. So to me, and then also when he says all these like sprite scaling and how they trick to have more layers, I don't know. I didn't think it had 4 layers. I mean, it looked like it was as good as a Super Nintendo at the time. And they do use a lot of sprite scaling. So everything they're telling you is true. And I also remember a lot of Super Nintendo games having a lot of slowdown. Street Fighter, like Contra 3 was one of them. Like when the dragon appears and it loops over your your soldier in the first level. Massive slowdown. So they're not lying for sure. There was a lot of slowdown in Super Nintendo games. So, I mean, I never knew as a kid what it was, but I could tell there was slowdown. Did it bother me? Did it make the games worse? Nah. I'm sure you ask Super Nintendo fans, they would be like, it's a small price to pay for all the color, right?
For sure. I mean, with all that color, whatever, who cares?
It's all about the game, right? If you had fun.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about the game if you had fun. And I'll be honest, like, as a kid, I did notice the SNES had more colors, but I preferred the Genesis sound. And I don't know if I'm alone in that, but the SNES felt so soft to me in its music, and it felt so synthetic. Whereas the Genesis it felt like, it's hard to put into words because it's sound, but I don't know.
The sound chip just had its own like vibe, like especially when you get games like Streets of Rage, they had that like I don't know, it has like this texture to the sound. That Super Nintendo was just totally different. I'm not saying there's not a lot of good Super Nintendo music, but I mean, I also think that there's some Genesis game that have this like weird look that I think looks like the art style looks kind of low poly. Like you could tell they're like, I don't know, maybe it's just because a lot of games were rushed at the time. But at the same time, there's like games like Gunstar Heroes and like Sonic that look amazing. So it's hard to tell, I mean, how much effort a developer put into the game. But moving on, one other unique aspect of Gunstar Heroes is the actual name. How did it come about? Was it there the whole time? Nope. According to an old Sega Ages interview, the original game they wanted was Lunatic Gunstar. According to the team, they thought Lunatic was a good description of the fast-paced action they were going for. Sega of America didn't like the word. They thought it had a negative connotation and rejected it. Okay, let me finish this, and then I'll ask you what you think about the name. The team then decided to pay homage to Blade Runner and call the game Blade Gunner. But that was also rejected by Sega of America based on copyright concerns. Sega of America suggested the word Heroes, and so Gunstar Heroes became the final title. This microphone's acting all weird. So what do you think of the names Lunatic Gunstar and Blade Gunner?
I think Lunatic Gunstar is kind of awful. It just seems like two random words slapped together. Blade Gunner, again, it's too similar to Blade Runner. And we've seen this a lot at the time. Like, I feel like Japanese developers were like, can't we just straight rip off an 80s movie? You know, like to the point where they're like, can't we just steal characters, and can't we just steal sound effects and like actual screens from the movie? You know, and just like, and then I'm sure Sega of America are like, what are you doing? Like, please stop doing that.
It's actually, you know what's funny though? Like,
what?
Blade Gunner sounds like a sequel to a Gunstar Heroes inspired. Well, I say inspired, but it was literally they ripped off Gunstar Heroes. But there's this game on the PlayStation called Rapid Reload, and its a Japanese name is Gunner's Heaven. So it's like Blade Gunner. It just sounds like there's already something there, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. But I think Lunatic obviously sounds like a crazy person. So Sega of America was right. There is negative things. Like, imagine telling your mom, I want a game called Lunatic Gunstar. No. Gunstar Heroes sounds like a squad of heroes that are, shoot things.
Right, yeah, Lunatic Gunstar makes me think, like, people always go, and then this lunatic stormed in with a gun. You know, like, it sounds like that. Which is usually not a very good thing. So
I agree.
Good.
It's this is another game that Sega of America helped shape in the end, if only the name, to make it more marketable. Do you think their involvement in games during this period was mostly good or mostly bad? And I do know that they also shaped a lot of Sonic the Hedgehog. So, What do you think?
I'm going to side with Sega of America. I know there's a lot of bitterness from the Japanese side. We see that a lot in like interviews where they were like, we were trying to make Sonic the Hedgehog and America kept pushing back. But let's be honest, like, these decisions have led to successes. I honestly don't think Sonic with fangs and a girlfriend would have done as well. I don't think a game called Lunatic Gunstar would have done as well. So, I mean,
it's funny though, because like a lot of these Japanese developers kind of like, I feel like they get kind of annoyed by Sega. Like, they're like, we know better. I mean, we're creating the game. But at the same time, like, when the company, like, when they have a success and they never want to say like, oh, thank God they came in and stopped it. They're probably like, it would have been a success even if they didn't step in, right?
Right. And I think it's funny, too, that these Japanese developers are getting so much inspiration from American media. But then when it comes to Americans kind of help dictate and change the work they're doing to make it more consumable in America, the Japanese developers get angry, which is so weird. It's like, we have a game that rips off Die Hard. What do you think? Well, let's make some changes to it. How dare you? Bruno Dillinger is an original character. Do not steal.
And they also do a lot. Yeah, they also do a lot of copyright thing, which is surprising that Sega of America didn't pick up on it early on, like with the Shinobi stuff. So, yeah. Well, we know that Treasure only started with 18 employees, since they had two games in development at the same time. This one and the McDonald's one. They had to split their small teams in half. Gunstar's Heroes core team consisted of 6 people, 2 programmers, 2 graphic designers, and 2 sound programmers. The full development cycle for Gunstar Heroes was 5 to 10 months. According to them, like, even though they had graphic designers, they also knew how to program, so everybody programmed. One thing that Gunstar Heroes tried was to take advantage of the power of the Sega Genesis, provided which led the team to work on sprite scaling and sprite rotations on a lot of this was used in the bosses and stuff. And then also other tricks to give the game levels depth. The team also used tricks. Oh yeah, like they said in the quote. It made it seem like there was 3 to 4 layers, but the Genesis only supported 2 layers in the background. I think the Mickey Mouse game did this a lot, and so did Sonic the Hedgehog, where it made it seem like there was way more backgrounds and more depth. So I think they did that well, because I remember as a kid when I first played Sonic the Hedgehog 2, I was like, whoa, look, you can see all the way in the back, way back there, look at that. So what are your thoughts on sprite scaling and rotation done in this game? Because I remember when I was a kid, one of my friends said that, like, when we were playing Contra or I forget, Demon's Crest, I think, there was a lot of these games where in Super Nintendo where you would fly a ship, and then they would have these like scaling where it looked like it was kind of like Fox 3D or fake 3D. And they always tell me that Super Nintendo, I mean Genesis, could never do this, and this is one of those games that like did it in a different way, with like limbs would like rotate and like backgrounds would rotate sometimes, So what are your thoughts on them getting this out of the Sega Genesis and working really smooth out of all?
I think it's impressive. I had a 32X, and when I played Gunstar Heroes, I would kind of have to like adjust my vision, because I'm like, am I looking at a 32X game? It did a lot of things that I didn't think the Genesis itself was capable of. But when you take the deep dive into Treasure's games, you're going to see that time and time again. Like, they get away with some pretty cool, innovative graphical stuff that you either just haven't thought possible, or like in the case of they did Bangai-O?
Yeah, they did.
Yeah. So I mean, that's one where it's not like they're pushing the graphic capabilities, but just the mere idea of them making these tiny little sprites and then just going insane on the screen, I thought was amazing at the time, just as this was, where they were pushing the Genesis to do things you were told by Nintendo it wasn't capable of. So I think, honestly, it's a lot of games just had a rush development. And so people will look at some of the worst that the Genesis had to offer, and they'll think, it's cheap graphics and low color count, bad music. And it's like, no, they had the tools to make something great, as evidenced by what Sonic Team, Treasure, and other teams did. It's just, it all depends on the people using the tools.
It definitely does. And even, and it was still like a wild west of like development. It's obvious that Treasure had a lot of love for the Sega Genesis. I mean, just by playing Gunstar Heroes, like all the things they do in every game, every level, you're like, wait, you could do that on the Sega Genesis? Why isn't anybody else doing this? Like, I was impressed by even the logo, the way like it moves. It looks like a 3D object. That's
that was cool.
Yeah, so little things like that, you're like, yeah, they added that extra like quality right on top of it. So obviously a great debut for them and a great game for the Sega Genesis. When developing the game, the team took a anything goes approach and tried to implement as many crazy ideas as they could. One of these is weapon combination mechanic that was talked about in early planning stages, and the team even tweaked attributes to weapons all the way to the end of development. And the whole point was to allow gamers to play the game in different ways to try to beat it their own way. The game also featured bosses with multiple limb effects, most notably the boss Seven Force. Since you can't have one large sprite, Seven Force was actually a combination of smaller sprites, circles, and triangles to make one big sprite that moved around. That way they could save VRAM. This would obviously make the game not slow down, which is crazy because I feel like Gunstar Superheroes on the game, the sequel, slows down a lot on the Game Boy Advance, but whatever.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the bosses with multiple limbs and weapon combination system?
I thought the bosses, I mean, first off, when you kick off the game and you have different weapons, you pick where you want to go. Like, I didn't play that many games at the time that was so open with what stage you start at. I'm trying to think like Quackshot, maybe DuckTales on the NES, like not that many. I wasn't into Mega Man, so I wasn't really aware of that at the time. So to see something like that, where you have so many options and so many ways to play the game, made this such a replayable game because you can kick it off and it's never the same level. And I know, people treat the first level of a lot of games as iconic because they see it again and again. And for developers, they always have to make that first level extremely memorable because that's the first thing people are going to play again and again. Few people are going to see Scrap Brain Zone, but everyone's going to see Green Hill Zone. So in the case of this, though, what I thought was really interesting was they had all these levels throwing at you at once, so that not only did they have to make each one memorable, but they had to make it so that you're like, oh, I just tried this one. I didn't complete the game. Next time I replay it, though, I'm going to start at this one and see what happens. And then it extended into the bosses. Like the bosses were really innovative. They didn't play the same way twice, really. Like each one was very different. Playing games like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Hyperstone Heist, like every boss was just a bigger guy that you fought, and they had one weird little attack. But there wasn't much more to it than that. But these, like, there were dice that you rolled. And and I think looking forward, like Sonic Mania, they really took a lot of inspiration from this game, because you look at the bosses there and they're not really Sonic bosses. They're like, they kind of remind me of treasure bosses, just in how over the top they are and how they rely on these things where they like have different weapon combinations, both with the bosses, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Did you make that connection?
With Mania, not with Mania, like but I've noticed that a lot of these like newer indie games, like I guess Cuphead, they take a lot of ideas from Treasure. Like even that game, like one of the big ideas is that every boss is super hard and you have to figure out a way to beat them. And I feel like Treasure was the first one in my mind to like do this. Maybe they even started it back in Contra, because like I remember first playing Contra 3, and they had the turtle one or whatever where you have to hit the red dot. And so like I could see them like that's their, when they started, but like Gunstar Hero took that idea and like amped it up to 11, because like it's like you have this guy that's like going on the side, like you start the fight horizontally. And then you blow up a bridge, and then all of a sudden you're free falling with this thing, and then you guys are fighting while you're free falling. So it's like, what's going on? This game's insane.
And I think a more apt comparison maybe would be to Platinum Games. I mean, I brought that up before, but I feel like both Treasure and Platinum Games made bosses fun, because bosses typically like you're kind of like the boss, and it's just kind of a headache, and it's like I'm gonna lose, or it's very samey. But like Bayonetta, it's a game of bosses. Every villain you play, you fight is basically a boss. Like, and here with the Treasure games, you looked forward to getting to the boss because you were like, what crazy stuff are they going to throw at me this time? So I mean, kudos to them on that.
And what's your opinion on like Western games not really having memorable bosses, or like kind of skipping the idea of a boss to like move on to like, I guess, tell a story or an adventure? Like Uncharted, like nobody talks about the bosses in those games because they're terrible. Like the idea of that game is because the adventure is what's fun. It's like Indiana Jones and storytelling. But then the last boss is so bad that I'm like, oh man, what is this? Like, I feel like American developers don't respect the idea of a boss fight as much as like Treasure did at the time. So I don't know.
Yeah, it's almost like they just treat it as like it's something to be like, well, we got to throw the boss in here. What is it? Well, let's just develop one big bad and then just kind of change up the graphics and present it 8 times throughout the game, and we're done. That's
the easy way to do it.
You kind of see that with Japanese developers too. Like the Sonic games, I feel like have really declined in boss quality. You look at Sonic Forces, and it's like the same 3 types of bosses again and again. It's kind of lazy. So I wouldn't say it's just a Western developer thing, but maybe it's kind of seeping into Japan, where people don't try as hard with bosses. So that's why people get so excited when a company like Platinum Games, or back in the day, Treasure, were releasing a new game. It's like, all right, here we go. These are the guys who get it. They know to make a complete package of a fun experience instead of treating a boss like, like a chore, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So while we always tell you our favorite aspects of games, it's rare to hear what developers liked or remember about their own game. But thankfully, we have a group interview with Treasure a year after Gunstar came out by Beep Magazine. It was translated by Lations.com. And they have a Patreon if you guys want to support them to do more translations. They interviewed 5 people from Treasure, including Murata, he's listed as sound designer here, but he's the president of the company, right? Or is it Satoshi? So maybe he's a different person. But Yuchi, who is a background designer, said, they asked him, looking back at this year's development, could you each tell us about some of your favorite scenes or memories from Gunstar Heroes? Yuchi, who is a background designer, said, one memorable part of Gunstar Hero development for me was the beginning of stage 1. I redrew the very first part of this stage, the area with the natives' huts in the trees, about 4 times. The color palette and hue was more kiddie and gamey at first. We were reusing a palette, which was an efficient use of memory, but it looked kind of cheap, which is kind of funny because I think they're reusing the McDonald's one. And Kikuchi, who worked on he was a character designer, said, for me, it would be the pink lobster boss fight from stage 7. When we were working on Gunstar Heroes, the Mega Drive game Mazin Saga had just been released, and I thought it was amazing. It inspired me to try designing the enemy patterns, not with simple mathematical algorithms, but with data I inputted manually by hand. Pink Lobster and other enemies I made were the end result of my experiments with that method. I also love the outer space backgrounds in the fight. It's the most beautiful scene in the game. Siganami, who he was a programmer, said, yeah, and it also ate up a buttload of memory. He laughs. Anyway, for me, the most memorable part of development was designing the rotating title logo. That was the very first program I had wrote for the Mega Drive. And Murata, who he was also a programmer, said, I was in charge of the sound effects, which is weird because he's a programmer. With FM synthesis, it's not as easy as sampling to get the right sound effects, like the metal chink sound. That's why the sound in stage 2 when Yuchin Force is banging fiercely against the wall was a really memorable one for me. And then Nororo, who is not even listed here, I don't know why. Hanzawa did the music, by the way, and he's not here today because he's hard at work in the next Treasure game. I'm going to surprise you. And then Kikuchi said, shh, that's supposed to be a secret. And then they asked him that he sends his regards, though, and told us that his favorite scene was stage 5 when the melancholic music is playing against the backdrop of a beautiful sunset. And they talk a little bit more. You can read the interview. I don't think this is needed to since we're already running late on this episode. But did hearing the developers talk about their experience making little things like the title screen rotate make you think differently on how much work goes into a game like Gunstar Heroes?
I think in general, doing this show with you, I've learned that in the Master System and Mega Drive era, that things were not like they are now. Very small teams, people working on things that they are not, is not their focus. And in some cases, they probably have no idea what they're actually doing. But in the end, they learned something about an area of game development they probably would not have otherwise. So that's good. But really, it seems like a lot of these great games that we talk about did not actually have much of a structure. outside of someone being the lead, like they just kind of do what needs to be done to get the game completed. And the development timeline too for these surprises me. I had no idea they were so quick.
Oh
So
yeah, they're so
yeah.
and not only that, I love like the little like you could tell these guys are like friendly towards each other and they know each other. They're even talking about a guy that's not there. I feel like now with game development, it's one of those like it's so big that you don't really get this kind of friendship outside of maybe obviously the guys that worked on Sonic Mania, which they worked with a team probably as size of this, have a total different experience. I would love to talk to some of these people and see that have worked in like making massive games for like Ubisoft or like a AAA game for Sega, and then going and making a game with people that are small. Like I guess it could always have the drawbacks, right? Like you could have all these artistic people that don't agree with each other and they're just butting heads. But when you're in a big company, you guys are like a sweatshop. So it's like, oh yeah, shut up. I'm the boss here. You do this. Or if not, we'll just replace you, right? I guess both things have their own positives and negatives. But let's talk about the legacy of Gunstar Heroes. To me, it's one of those games that like I thought growing up when I played it, and nobody told me about it outside of that one guy, that it was super underground. Nobody would remember this game as one of those like gems that I found. But like once I started going on the internet and talking to Sega fans, I knew that it had its movement and people did like it. Gunstar Heroes finally got its released in Japan on September 10th, 1993, and released worldwide in the same month. Sega Japan underestimated the demand for the game and only shipped an initial 10,000 units to store shelves, while Sega America also ordered a small print run as they weren't confident in Sega Japan games. The game also didn't receive much advertisement and spread mostly via the word of mouth. Like, I can't remember this even having an ad. So when it was all said and done, the game shipped around 70,000 units in Japan and over 200,000 units overseas. Are you surprised that the game received such a low print run when released? Even though people that worked at Treasure had a proven track record, they made Contra, they made TMNT. Do you think maybe Sega just thought, well, they sold those games because those games were Castlevania and those games were TMNT?
I'm not surprised. I mean, regardless of what their history is, at the end of the day, this is a game that, people are not going to recognize on a shelf from a new development studio. And I keep making the Platinum Games comparisons, but just today, as we record this, they had to launch a Kickstarter to get Wonderful 101 remastered. Like,
isn't that insane though?
This is a studio that created Bayonetta, that has a 10th anniversary 2-pack coming out with Vanquish. Like, clearly there are publishers behind them, but they want to self-publish, and they need our money to remaster probably one of their least popular games.
Yeah, well, I mean, okay, so I don't even want to get into this game, but like, I really wish they just launched a brand new game, but I understand why they're doing Wonderful One. It's already made. It's easy to get funding that way. But I would love to see Treasure try something like this, because the last time we've heard from them, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, they said that they're working on stuff right now. I think in 2018 they had their last interview when I was doing research for this, and they said they have something working, but I've been hearing this since the 360 era. When they re-released Ikagura and Radiant Silvergun on 360, they said they had a contract with Microsoft to make a third game in the series, which never happened, and Microsoft just shut up about it. So, I don't know, man. We'll see how it happens, but this is a new section we're adding to this show. I want you guys to give me some feedback, but it's basically me going and picking some review snippets, and then we'll talk about the review snippets in the end. But most reviews at the time fell in love with Gunstar Heroes and mostly had positive things to say about it in the reviews. It was so positive that it surprised Treasure, with big publications like EGM giving it their Game of the Month. They also placed first in Beep Mega Drive readers rankings in Japan, meaning it was their number one game that released. According to EGM's Ed Sumrad, this card represents the fact that the Genesis can still beat out the competition. This has got to be one of the most intense carts to date, providing non-stop blasting, hand-to-hand combat, quote, that's right, combat thrills that will strain your abilities to the max. There are plenty of levels and an absolute riot to play through. And the fact that it has 2 players, you have a fantastic winner. IGM was reviewed, because back then they would review 4 people. They gave it a 9999.
9999.
And it was Game of the Month, which was a big deal back then. I remember getting the magazine and always looking to see what was the Game of the Month and being like, I'll rent that one, back in the Dreamcast era. So, Sega only magazines also raved about the game. According to Mean Machine Sega, their review, we thought we'd seen it all on the Mega Drive, but Sega once again ignored the preconceived ideas about their machine's limitation and call upon the scale and rotate sprites all over the place. While most magazines at the time gave the game high marks, Edge magazine, the edgiest magazine of all time, was one of the outliers, giving the game a 6 out of 10, saying in their short review, this is just the end of the review, it looks good, sounds good, and plays well, but after completing the game, you get no great urge to return to it, even with 2 players. There are no hitting levels to find, no secret screens. You get what you see. Gunstar Heroes is great while it lasts, but it doesn't last long. What are your thoughts on the game getting universally high ranks? And do you feel now that that it's been so long that Edge magazine might have overrated a little bit the replayability of the game?
Yeah, I think that last one that you read is just kind of bullshit. Like,
it's funny though, because they're still praising the game, but like, I mean, let's be honest. Okay, say give it a 7, give it an 8, right? Like, you loved everything about it, but it's not long enough. Okay, can you say that? Can some people say that? Yeah, sure. I've heard that about Sonic, right?
Yeah,
so,
and it's like, all right, so it looks good. I'd argue it looks great. Sounds good. I'd argue it sounds great. It plays well. I'd say it plays very well. All of these are positives. But after completing the game, you get no great urge to return to it. I disagree, because if you enjoyed your experience, you're going to go back and maybe you're going to play as a different character. Maybe you're going to try different weapons. Maybe you're going to start at a different stage, because you don't start at the same stage. And this is what I think is so funny. They go, there's no hidden levels to find. Like, how many games have hidden levels? What's a hidden level? What do you mean?
Like, I don't know. It's like, can you imagine like having
level?
this? Like, let's go back to Sega Classics.
Yeah.
Well, Outrun's pretty good. He plays great, sounds great, but once you beat it, there's no urge to drive again. It's like, well, the idea of like taking your course, you know, like I guess they have different courses there in this one. But to me, it's like very like, well, you could replay the unique levels they created, try different weapons and different combinations in different areas, see which one, how you could beat it easier. I mean, there's some stuff you could do, and there's even 2 players like they praised, but they say they don't even care about that in the review. So it's like, I don't know. Edge Magazine's always been known to give games lower scores, but
yeah, I just think it's kind of bullshit to like complain about no hidden levels or secret screens. Like, I can think of tons of games where I can't think of there being any hidden levels. Like, I don't really know what they mean. Like, I know what they're talking about. Like, I never expect that. I'm never like, oh man, I played through all of Sonic 1 and there was no hidden level. There wasn't a 9th or an 8th zone or something, or secret screens. Like, what do you mean? Like a hole you go into and you're like, oh, no one's found this before. And then also the complaint of it's great while it lasts, but doesn't last long. I'd argue a lot of games back then were too long and boring. Like, I watch Let's Plays. The guy will be complaining, going, "Oh my god, am I on the first level still?" And it'll be like an hour in, you know. And it's like,
and that's like some games that I think did that they would like. I'll even bring up a Sega game just so people won't say I'm like a Super Nintendo hater, but like Vector Man suffers from it, where like it's 40 levels or some crazy stuff, and it's like a lot of these levels are repeated like set pieces of bad guys. They did it. I love Vector, man. I love the look of the game, but man, you're gonna cut that game to 20 stages, 15 stages. But
right.
I mean, so there's some games like that where what I would say that it's the double-edged sword. I could see them. This is something that we talked about when Vanquish came out, when I was reviewing it, and it was really hard for me because at the time people were bashing the game because it was so short. It was 6 hours for a $6 game. So I think it was like 5 hours if you're good enough. So it's like, is a game that you beat the single player and there's no multiplayer worth $60? And in the end, the way that the game was designed, I thought that it was fine. It was like an arcade game where you wanted to get the high score, so you had to play the game over and over again. So if you're coming in it with that mindset, it's fine. And I feel like some reviewers don't understand that there's different ways to play a game and it has different value to the player just based on that. And and back then, I'm surprised it was universally, I guess, loved. Because even I also liked the reviews back then, how they used to write reviews like abilities to the max. That's like, we need to start writing reviews like that. You know what I mean? I miss the good old 90s reviews. They were so ridiculous. It was like everything was so over the top, right? It's like hand-to-hand combat. And even though the game had a legacy, there was also, this is another version of the game that I never really hear people talk about, and it's actually kind of interesting because most people know Gunstar Heroes from the Sega Genesis version, but there was also a Game Gear version released in 1995, and this one was done by M2. Did you know that? Well, all the way back in 1995, M2 ported the game to the Game Gear. So if you guys don't know who M2 is the people that do the Sega Ages ports, and they did the Mega Drive Mini. And so I never played the Game Gear version, but from what I've read, they took out, while a lot of people think it's a good conversion for what it's an 8-bit game. You're literally cutting it in half of power, right? Or less. Right. They said that they took away some of the bosses, including the blackjack. So it's like, oh, that's kind of hard for me. Like, obviously the definitive version is the Mega Drive version, but I do like the way that they look in 8-bit. I think it looks kind of cute. So there's some positives. If you had a Game Gear at the time, I guess, or if you were rich like you'd have a Nomad and you wouldn't have to worry about it, huh? You get all the 16-bit on the go.
Exactly. That was me. Yeah.
No, I'm joking. I didn't know if you had one back then, but I wish.
Yeah, I got a Nomad a year after it released. I got it used at like a Babbage's or whatever.
Oh, it's kind of like. Yeah. I was gonna say there was also a Mega Play arcade version, but like those Mega Play arcade versions are usually the same thing. At least from what I've noticed. So I didn't really write notes. But I actually didn't write notes about this either because my computer updated, right? So the last bit is the game did get a sequel. This is something that a lot of people do not talk about, but it was called Gunstar Superheroes in the United States. It came out on the Game Boy Advance. I thought this was a lot better than their Gunstar Guardian Advance Heroes. And I owned that one. I was actually super hyped. I went to Target day one, got it, even though nobody cared about the game. And I remember it was already when the DS was coming out, and I was just like, Treasure's making sequels, guys. We got to support it, everybody, right? And I'm like on the internet telling everybody, like, get this game. You have to get this game. Personally, they kind of do a lot of retreads where they use a lot of aspects from the first one, but then they have a lot of other stuff in it that makes it feel its own game. But a lot of people, one thing that I hated about the game was that they used the L and the R a lot, and man, it's no good in the Game Boy. They use those
it's
trigger.
tough.
It hurts your hand.
Yeah.
So this game, this sequel for the Game Boy Advance, I wish would get a Sega Ages release so I could use a regular controller and maybe get some more content in it. Maybe take away some of the slowdown.
That'd be cool.
That would be really sick, but let's talk about some of the ports. I would say that the best port, obviously, is always going to be the Sega Ages port on the 3DS. I hope it gets a Switch release soon because it'd be nice to play it on a 1080p TV screen. But outside of that,
Yeah,
Go on.
3D Classics. You mean, right? You said Sega.
3D Classics. Sorry.
Yeah, it gets confusing, but
was it still called Sega Ages? Like they're still the
no.
same thing. Okay.
Sega Ages
3D
was
Classes.
the PS2 series.
And there was also a PS2 one released, right? So
I believe so, yeah. And then 3D Classics was the 3DS one.
And it's I would hope that, I mean, I think we're all like have a long list of Sega Ages releases we want, but I think this one seems kind of obvious since they already did the 3D Classics one. Outside of this, there's you could play it on the Mega Drive Mini or Genesis Mini, and it's also on Sega Forever. And
that's right.
I mean, those are the ways to play it. But anything else you want to add before we close up the episode?
No, outside of just the usual, give this game a look. If you haven't played it, it's very easy to find. I feel like we've been covering a lot of Sega Ages and Genesis mini games recently, so that's great. It's a really easy way to go out and play the game that otherwise would be behind glass at your retro game store, and they're like, oh, this is Gunstar Heroes, it's worth $150 or some nonsense. Forget that. I'm sorry, but just go buy a port of it. You don't need to buy the original cartridge. Nonsense. Collectors.
As long as you play the game, though. If you do buy it for $150, play the game. Don't be like those guys that like are all like, I just bought this game, I don't even know what it's like, but it's going on my shelf, it looks pretty.
Yeah, exactly. Play it. God damn it. Should we see what these Patreon people have to say? Yeah, so if you support Sega Bits on Patreon, at any tier, you get first dibs, in fact, only dibs, on having your memories of the game we cover talked about at the end. So here are the people that submitted their memories. We have Daniel Andres, who seems to always have something to say, even if they haven't played it. Let's see what they have to say. So, I haven't gotten much time with this game yet, but I distinctly remember an old friend of mine named Jonathan. Let's all remember Jonathan. I remember Jonathan, he was really into this game. Back in 2015, we played some of it together off the Genesis collection for PC. I still have to get into it sometime. Well, now's the time. We have Mithril Fox, I believe a new backer, so thank you for your support. Gunstar Heroes was a heck of a ride, a fantastic game for its time. Sadly, one memory that I've always reminded us is the tedious dice room. It felt like we were there for most of the game. That's interesting. That's like my favorite part of the game. But
I mean, maybe my opinion on it was because it was like, I've never seen a stage like that. Like, it's a board game within the stage. It's pretty insane. And then they had its own levels.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to break this, but like going to the Mania thing, I think that was my connection, was that sudden Mean Bean Machine game where you're like, oh, I guess we're doing a puzzle game now in the middle of a Sonic game. So I could see how you're like, this is not what I signed up for. Nicholas Schaefer had this to say: what a wonderful, fast-paced game. That made all the Nintendo fanboys jealous. Right up there with Sonic. I remember pointing at it and going to see that's what you can do with blast processing. Yeah, I totally bought into Sega PR. No, blast processing is real. It's not PR. It's real. No. Just like full reactive IS entertainment. It's a real thing.
It's all
it is. Do you want to close this up?
Just, if you guys want to support the show, check us out on patreon.com/SegaBits. We love your support. We'll catch you on the next episode. And I swear it won't be another treasure game. Not for a bit, at least.
Yeah,
I kind of wanted to do. I was almost gonna do Radiant Silver Go next, but I was like,
Bangayo
that's
next week.
One?
Yeah.
That's another one? Anyway, no. All right. Thanks you guys for watching. Bye.